I find that 9/11 stemmed in large part from the inability of the CIA and FBI to adapt to the end of the Cold War. But there are two serious alternative arguments to consider. Now, I'm going to try to convince you that these first two alternatives are wrong and that my explanation is right. But I'm only half joking here. It's important for any argument to consider the strongest alternatives and show why they are not as compelling. Alternative hypotheses force us to think in different ways and contend with different interpretations of evidence. There's a cartoon that captures this idea well, which I've put on this slide. You know the old saying that the optimist sees the glass as half full and the pessimist sees the glass as half empty. But to the engineer, the glass is twice as large as it needs to be. Alternative explanations matter, and we need to take them seriously. So the first alternative explanation is that there really was no adaptation failure of intelligence agencies. According to this view, hindsight is 20/20. In the 1990s, post-Cold War dangers were too opaque, too numerous, and changing too fast for U.S. intelligence agencies to have anticipated and responded to the terrorist threat more effectively than they did. As President Clinton's former national security advisor, Sandy Berger, put it, history is written through a rearview mirror, but it unfolds through a foggy windshield. Well, historical evidence strongly challenges this view. The CIA director gives an annual public threat assessment to Congress, and these started being publicly released in 1994. I examined these threat assessments from 1994 to 2001 and found that the CIA's threat priorities were highly stable and, in retrospect, on target. Terrorism made the top threat list every year from 1994 to 2001, and in fact, from 1998 on, terrorism ranked in the top 3 threats. It was the number 1 threat listed by the CIA director in early 2001. Public statements and actions by political officials during the 90s also reveal a crescendo of warnings about terrorism long before September 11th. Beginning in 1994, for example, terrorism made it into every single State of the Union address, the most important policy speech the president gives to the nation each year. And in 1999, the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, wrote an op-ed to an obscure little paper called The Washington Post, in which he explicitly predicted a terrorist attack on American soil. These are just a couple of examples. Now, it could be that intelligence officials and policymakers understood the terrorist threat, but didn't see the connection to the need for intelligence reform. Well, I found that the imperative for intelligence reform was also well known in Washington in the 1990s. This slide lists every unclassified major report on intelligence or terrorism issued between the Cold War's end in 1991 and 9/11. So that's a 10-year period. I want to emphasize that this is not a sample of reports. It is the universe of major unclassified studies issued by presidential commissions, government agencies, or think tanks. And what you'll see here is that there are 12 reports in all, and they include a range of studies from the National Commission on Terrorism to the FBI's own strategic plan. Together, these studies issued 514 recommendations for reform in the U.S. government. Importantly, 2/3 of these recommendations, or 340, called for improving U.S. intelligence capabilities. So I tracked what happened to all of the 340 intelligence reform recommendations, and here's what I found. Only 35% of all those recommendations, or 10% of the total, were successfully implemented between 1991 and 2001. The red area of the pie chart shows that the vast majority of reforms, 268 recommendations, or 79% of the total, resulted in no action whatsoever. And by no action, I mean no action. No phone call, no meeting, no memo. Now, for those of you who are well-versed in the ways of Washington, you'll suspect that the real picture is worse, and you'd be right, because the implemented recommendations were among the least important. They were recommendations to study the problem more, for example. Next, I took a closer look at the substance of these reports, and I found that they agreed to a surprising extent on the key issues. 84% of those 340 intelligence recommendations focused on just 4 major problems, and they're going to sound familiar. The first set of problems was poor personnel systems that created major skill gaps and built stovepipes that hindered information sharing. The second set of problems was the IC's or the intelligence community's lack of coherence or corporateness. Third, there was a clustering of recommendations around weaknesses in setting intelligence priorities. And fourth and finally, a number of recommendations focused on improving insufficient human intelligence. These reports, in retrospect, were right on target. The 2 most important 9/11 postmortems, the 9/11 Commission and the Congressional Intelligence Committee's joint inquiry, identified the same 4 problems as crucial failings that left the United States vulnerable to the September 11th terrorist attacks. In short, a great deal of evidence suggests that before 9/11, policymakers and intelligence officials saw the terrorist threat, and they understood the need for organizational reform, but they failed to get the changes they believed were vitally necessary. So that's the first alternative argument. The second alternative argument about why we failed to stop 9/11 admits agency failure, but lays the blame on individuals. This is the finger-pointing explanation that we've read the most about in the press. Everyone has someone to blame for 9/11. Immediately after the attacks, many Democrats blamed Republicans, many Republicans blamed Democrats, and some from both parties blamed CIA Director George Tenet. This finger-pointing approach is both understandable and dangerous. It's understandable because casting blame after moments of great tragedy is a natural human response. It makes for good politics and good journalism. But it's also dangerous because it suggests the wrong causes of failure and the wrong remedies to address them. We are left to think that if only a few important people had connected a few obvious dots, if more people in Washington had had their hair on fire, then tragedy could have been averted. As Bob Woodward wrote in his book, The Commanders, decision-making at the highest levels is a complex human interaction. This human story is the core. Well, actually, I find that the human story is largely irrelevant. Those who want to learn what went wrong and how to fix it need to understand something far less glamorous, and it's called bureaucracy, the organizational weaknesses that lead smart people to make poor decisions.